Something is terribly wrong in Raven Hollow. A girl, covered in mud, left alone in the middle of a storm, unable to speak, her belly strangely swollen. The only clue? Her name, Hannah Wright. But who abandoned her? And why does she react with terror at the mention of her father? A disgraced ex-cop with a past no one dares to talk about. This story is full of lies, betrayals, and secrets that have been buried for too long. And when the truth finally comes out, nothing will ever be the same again. Do you think you know what's happening? Think again. Nothing is what it seems in this story. If you love drama, mysteries, and shocking revelations, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave your theories in the comments below. But be warned, this story will take you places you never expected. The night the fire started, the town of Raven Hollow was drowning in rain. The storm had rolled in fast, swallowing the streets in thick sheets of water, the wind howling like a warning no one could understand. In the middle of it all, Emily Wright sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. The ink was smudged from her tears, but the words were still clear. You should have never come back. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m., but Emily knew there was no time left. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. The line rang once, twice, a third time, then a voice, groggy and unfamiliar. Emily? She exhaled sharply, her heartbeat thudding against her ribs. I don't have much time. They know. A pause, a heavy breath, then get out. Now. She stood, stuffing the letter into her pocket, grabbing the small duffel bag she had packed weeks ago, just in case. But as she turned toward the door, a shadow moved outside her window. Her breath caught in her throat. They were already here. Down the hall, Hannah Wright, barely 10 years old at the time, lay curled in her bed, the sound of rain lulling her in and out of a restless sleep. Something pulled at the edge of her consciousness. A scent. Thick, acrid. Smoke. Her eyes snapped open just as the hallway outside her room glowed orange. Fire. Panic surged through her veins as she scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. Mom! Her voice was small, weak against the roar of the flames as she yanked open the door. The heat hit her instantly, searing her skin, making her eyes water. Through the thick smoke, she saw movement. A figure, her mother, stumbling toward her, coughing violently, shielding her face from the growing inferno. Hannah! Emily's voice was strangled, desperate. Come here. Now. Hannah didn't hesitate. She ran, her mother's arms wrapping around her like a shield. But something was wrong. Behind Emily, the fire spread unnaturally fast, almost as if, no, that didn't make sense. Fire didn't move like that. Someone had started this. The realization slammed into her like a physical blow. Before she could process it, the floor beneath them groaned. A sickening crack echoed through the air. No! Emily shoved her forward just as the floor collapsed behind them, swallowing everything in flames. Hannah screamed as she fell onto the carpet, her hands burning against the heat. But her mother was gone. The fire engulfed the place where Emily had been standing just seconds before. Hannah's ears rang with the sound of destruction. A deafening explosion rocked the house, sending debris flying as the ceiling cracked. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then strong arms, lifting her, carrying her. A voice murmuring, "I've got you, kid. You're safe." But when she looked up, she didn't recognize the man holding her. His face was shadowed by the fire's glow, his voice unfamiliar. Before she could say anything, her world went dark. When she woke, she was in a hospital bed. The sterile smell burned her nose, the beeping of machines surrounding her like whispers in the dark. Her body ached, her lungs raw from the smoke, and across the room, sitting rigidly in a chair, was her father, Daniel Wright, the man she had barely known, the man who was supposed to protect them. He looked older than she remembered, his once strong frame now slumped, his face lined with exhaustion. But his eyes, they were hollow, empty. "Hannah," he said, his voice rough. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream at him, But she didn't. She just stared, the memory of the fire burning behind her eyelids. "Mom," her voice cracked. Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's gone." The words felt like knives. She had always known, deep down, but hearing it made it real. Her mother was gone. And her father, he had done nothing to stop it. The weeks that followed blurred together. The funeral was small, quiet. Barely anyone showed up. Daniel didn't speak much, only drinking more, his presence in the house turning into a ghost. People whispered when they passed on the street. "That's the cop whose wife died in the fire. They say it wasn't an accident. He's not the man he used to be." And then, one night, Hannah overheard a conversation that would haunt her forever. "I know what you did," a voice hissed. She had woken up thirsty, heading toward the kitchen when she heard it. Daniel's voice, low and dangerous. "You have no proof," the other man sneered. "And even if you did, no one would believe you." Silence. Then the scrape of a chair. "If I ever find out you had something to do with that fire, I swear to God, you're in no position to make threats, right? You lost everything. No badge, no wife, and soon a pause. Soon you'll lose her too." Hannah's breath caught. She took a step back, heart hammering. The floor creaked beneath her foot, and instantly, the voices went silent. She held her breath, but it was too late. The door swung open, revealing her father standing there, eyes dark, unreadable. Behind him, the shadowy figure of the man he had been talking to disappeared into the night. "Go back to bed, Hannah," she wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers. But something in his expression stopped her. For the first time in her life, she was afraid of him. Years passed. The fire became a memory people avoided speaking of. Daniel lost his job. The drinking got worse. The debts piled up. Hannah learned to navigate around him to keep her distance. And then, one day, everything changed again. A letter arrived. A single envelope, placed carefully on their doorstep. No return address. No name. Just a single piece of paper inside. "You were never supposed to exist." She stared at the words, confusion twisting in her gut. What did that mean? She turned to Daniel, holding it out to him. But when he saw it, his face drained of all color. His hands trembled as he took it from her, his breathing shallow. "Where did you get this?" "It was outside." His grip tightened around the paper, his knuckles white. He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. Then, without another word, he ripped it into pieces and threw it into the trash. But Hannah saw it, the way his hands shook, the fear in his eyes. And for the first time since the fire, she knew her father was keeping secrets. And whatever they were, they had something to do with her. The letter haunted Hannah long after it had been torn to pieces. "You were never supposed to exist." The words were burned into her mind, playing over and over like a broken record. She tried to ignore them, tried to convince herself that it was just some cruel joke. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The way her father had reacted, the sheer terror in his eyes, was not the reaction of someone dismissing a prank. It was the reaction of someone who had just been confronted with a truth they had spent years trying to bury. She started watching him more closely after that, noticing the way his hands twitched when he thought no one was looking, the way he avoided meeting her eyes, the way he would disappear for hours at a time without explanation. And then there were the phone calls, late at night, barely a whisper through the walls. She never heard what was being said, only the low murmur of his voice, followed by long stretches of silence. Sometimes, she would catch him staring at the front door as if expecting someone to come knocking. Other times, he would sit in his old recliner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his lap, staring at nothing. She wanted to ask. She wanted to demand answers. But every time she opened her mouth, the words lodged in her throat. Because deep down, she was afraid of what he might say. And then, one night, something happened that changed everything. She woke to the sound of voices, angry, urgent. At first, she thought she was dreaming. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. A crash, followed by a muffled curse. Hannah shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She strained to hear, her entire body frozen with tension. You don't get to decide how this ends, right? The voice was low and threatening, dripping with something Hannah couldn't quite place. A pause. Then her father's voice, rough and slurred. You don't know what you're talking about. A bitter laugh. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do you. Silence. Thick, suffocating. Then a sound, a sharp inhale, as if someone had just been punched in the gut. You should have left when you had the chance. The voice continued, quieter now. But you didn't, did you? And now she's going to find out. Something in her father snapped. There was a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle, a grunt of pain, furniture scraping against the floor. A thud. Hannah's blood ran cold. She didn't think. She just moved. Throwing off the covers, she sprinted toward the door, yanking it open just in time to see her father shoving a man against the wall. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black. His face was partially obscured by the dim light, but his eyes, cold, calculating, locked onto hers instantly. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a slow smile spread across the man's face. Well, he murmured. Look who finally decided to join us. Daniel's grip tightened on the man's shirt. Get out. The man's eyes never left Hannah. You didn't tell her? Did you? Now, Daniel's voice was shaking, his entire body taut with tension. The man chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Relax, old friend. I'm leaving. He pushed away from the wall, adjusting his jacket. But just as he reached the door, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. It won't be long now, he said, his voice almost playful. She's already starting to remember, and then he was gone. Hannah stood frozen, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The room smelled like whiskey and sweat and something darker, something she couldn't name. Her father was staring at the door, his fists still clenched, his entire body shaking. Who was that? She demanded. Daniel didn't answer. She took a step closer, her hands curling into fists. Who was he? What was he talking about? Still nothing. Frustration surged through her veins like fire. Dad, go to bed, Hannah. His voice was quiet, too quiet, and when he finally turned to look at her, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. The next morning, he was gone. At first, she thought maybe he had just gone for one of his usual walks. But as the hours passed, dread coiled in her stomach. His truck was still in the driveway. His phone sat abandoned on the kitchen table. The house was eerily silent. And then she saw it. A single envelope sitting on the counter. Her name was written on the front in her father's messy scrawl. With shaking hands, she picked it up, tearing it open. Inside, there was only one sentence. Don't look for me. A sob caught in her throat. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. But it was. He was gone. Just like that. And she had no idea why. For the first few days, she convinced herself he would come back. That he had just needed space. But as the days turned into weeks, reality sank in. He wasn't coming back. The whispers started almost immediately. Guess he finally snapped. He was a wreck after his wife died. I heard he was into some shady business before he lost his badge. I bet he ran. Hannah stopped going outside. Stopped answering the phone. The only person who didn't treat her like a walking tragedy was John Carter, one of the few officers left in town who still had a shred of decency. He checked in on her occasionally, making sure she had food, making sure she was okay. But even he had questions she couldn't answer. Did he say anything before he left? No. Did he seem different? Yes. Did he ever mention the name Lucas Grant? She froze. The name sent a shiver down her spine, though she didn't know why. Carter studied her, his expression unreadable. If you remember anything, he said finally, you'll tell me, right? She nodded, lied, because she wasn't ready to tell him about the man in her house that night. And she definitely wasn't ready to tell him that sometimes. When she closed her eyes, she saw things, flashes of memories that didn't belong to her. A hospital, a voice whispering her name, a different name, not Hannah, something else, something she couldn't quite remember. And for the first time, she wondered, what if the letter had been right? What if she really wasn't supposed to exist? Days passed, then weeks, and still Daniel Wright did not return. The house felt emptier than ever, filled only with the echo of things left unsaid. The chair where he used to sit remained untouched. His jacket still hung by the door, a lingering reminder that he had walked out without a second thought. But the worst part, the part Hannah couldn't admit even to herself, was the gnawing feeling that maybe he had been planning to leave for a long time. Maybe his disappearance wasn't an impulse but a carefully orchestrated escape. Hannah spent most of her time in her room, avoiding the whispers in town, avoiding the pitying glances, avoiding John Carter's relentless questions. She told herself that she was fine, that she didn't need anyone, that whatever secrets her father had buried, they weren't hers to dig up. But the nightmares told a different story. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering. Visions of fire, of voices she didn't recognize, of cold hands pulling her into darkness. And always the same question echoing through her mind. Who am I? One afternoon, unable to ignore the weight of that question any longer, she finally did what she had sworn she wouldn't. She went into his room. The air inside felt heavy, as if time itself had stopped the moment he left. The bed was unmade, the blankets tossed aside. His dresser was cluttered with half-empty bottles of whiskey, old photographs, receipts crumpled into careless piles. She hesitated, staring at the space where he used to sleep, before stepping forward. Her fingers trembled as she opened the nightstand drawer. At first, it was just the usual things: spare change, a broken watch, an old pocket knife. But then her hand brushed against something solid. A box, shoved to the very back of the drawer. She pulled it out, heart pounding. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing a small stack of papers. A birth certificate, a faded photograph, a letter yellowed at the edges. Her eyes darted to the birth certificate first. She expected to see her name, Hannah Wright. But that wasn't what was written. The name on the paper was Eleanor Hayes. The air left her lungs. No, that couldn't be right. She stared at it, her mind racing. The date of birth was the same. The hospital was the same. But the name, why would her name be different? Unless she had never been Hannah Wright to begin with. She grabbed the photograph next. A woman she didn't recognize, holding a baby. The woman's face was soft, kind, but unfamiliar. There was something achingly familiar about her, yet Hannah was certain she had never seen her before. Her hands shook as she reached for the letter, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it means you have a choice to make. Tell her the truth or let her believe the lie. But whatever you do, keep her safe. You know what they're capable of. You know what they did to me. She was never supposed to exist. The words blurred as tears filled Hannah's eyes. Her entire world tilted. Her hands clenched around the paper as the realization settled in. Her father had lied to her about everything. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. Her name wasn't Hannah. Emily Wright might not have been her real mother. And worst of all, she had no idea who she really was. A knock at the front door made her jump. She stuffed the papers back into the box, shoving it under the bed before racing downstairs. Peering through the peephole, she saw John Carter standing outside, his expression unreadable. For a second, she considered pretending she wasn't home. But she knew he wouldn't leave. She opened the door slowly. "What do you want?" His gaze flickered over her face, searching. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. He entered, glancing around the house before turning back to her. "I'm worried about you." "I'm fine," she lied. "You don't look fine." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know this has been hard, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She crossed her arms, trying to act indifferent. "About what?" "Your father." Her stomach twisted. "What about him?" John hesitated. "Did he ever mention a woman named Eleanor Hayes?" Her blood ran cold. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "No." "Why?" His jaw tightened. Because that's the name on an old missing persons report I found. A woman who vanished years ago. The strange thing is, her daughter disappeared with her. Hannah's heart pounded. I don't know why Daniel left, John continued, but I do know that he was hiding something. And I think you deserve to know what it is. She swallowed hard. What are you saying? He looked at her, his eyes dark with meaning. I'm saying that your father might not be the man you think he is. She wanted to deny it, to push him away. But the birth certificate burned in her mind. The name she didn't recognize, the photograph of a woman who wasn't her mother. Her father had spent years running from something, and now it was catching up to her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to meet John's gaze. Then tell me the truth. His expression hardened. I don't know the truth, but I know where to start looking. The words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. And in that moment, Hannah knew her life would never be the same again. The truth had a way of creeping in when Hannah least expected it, like an unwelcome guest lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to pounce. She had spent years convincing herself that her life was normal, that the pain of losing her mother and the absence of her father were just unfortunate circumstances. But now, as she stood in her living room with John Carter's eyes locked onto hers, she realized that everything she thought she knew was a carefully constructed lie. Her name wasn't Hannah Wright. Her mother might not have been Emily Wright. And her father, he had disappeared for reasons she was only beginning to understand. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. John's presence in her house felt intrusive, like he had forced open a door she had kept shut for too long. He had just told her something impossible, something she wasn't ready to believe. Say that again, she whispered, her throat dry. John studied her, his expression unreadable. I found an old missing persons report. A woman named Eleanor Hayes. She vanished years ago, along with her daughter. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. That doesn't mean anything, she said quickly. Lots of people disappear. Not like this, John said. And not with this many unanswered questions. She shook her head, taking a step back. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? His voice was calm, measured. Your father left without a trace, Hannah. He didn't take his truck. He didn't take his phone. And now you're telling me he never once mentioned Eleanor Hayes to you? She hesitated. The way he was looking at her made her skin crawl, like she was a puzzle he was trying to piece together. No, she lied. John didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, watching her carefully. This is the missing persons report, the one from 20 years ago. Read it. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the page. The ink was faded, the edges yellowed with time. Her eyes skimmed over the text, her stomach twisting. Eleanor Hayes, age 28. Last seen Raven Hollow. Daughter, Eleanor Hayes Jr. age 2. Status, missing. She stared at the words, her vision blurring. It wasn't possible. It didn't make sense. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. John tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster. He wasn't in uniform, but he still carried his badge, still carried the weight of his authority. Hannah glanced at him, her pulse spiking. Are you expecting someone? He asked quietly. She shook her head. The knock came again, louder this time. John stepped forward, his expression hardening. Stay here, he murmured before opening the door. A woman stood on the porch, her silhouette illuminated by the dim porch light. She was older, maybe late 50s, with sharp blue eyes and a presence that demanded attention. She wore a long coat, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Can I help you? John asked, blocking the doorway. The woman's gaze flicked past him, landing on Hannah. You already have, she said. I've been looking for her for a long time. Hannah's breath caught. John didn't move. And you are? The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Margaret Hayes. The name hit Hannah like a fist to the chest. Hayes. The same name from the missing persons report. She felt like the walls were closing in, the floor shifting beneath her. She didn't know this woman. She had never seen her before in her life. So why did she feel like she had? John didn't step aside. What do you want with her? Margaret's eyes never left Hannah's. I want to tell her the truth. Hannah felt like she couldn't breathe. Every part of her screamed to slam the door, to run, to pretend this wasn't happening. But she couldn't. She was rooted in place, caught between terror and the undeniable need to know. John hesitated before finally stepping back. You have 5 minutes. Margaret walked in like she owned the place, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She stopped in front of Hannah, studying her like she was something fragile. You don't remember me, do you? Hannah's mouth was dry. Should I? Margaret sighed, shaking her head. No, I suppose not. You were too young. Hannah clenched her fists. Who are you? Margaret tilted her head, her expression softening. I'm your grandmother. The words sent a shockwave through her. John stiffened. That's a hell of a claim. It's not a claim, Margaret said simply. It's the truth. Your name is Eleanor Hayes Jr., and I've been searching for you ever since you disappeared. Hannah's breath hitched. No, my name is Hannah. Margaret gave her a sad smile. No, sweetheart. It never was. She felt sick. Her entire body trembled. You're lying. I wish I were. The room spun around her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Margaret took a step closer, her voice soft. Your mother, my daughter, loved you more than anything in this world. She would have done anything to keep you safe. And I believe that's exactly what she did. She ran. She hid you. But now the past is catching up to you. And you need to know what you're up against. John narrowed his eyes. Up against what? Margaret's expression darkened. The people who took her. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. Hannah's chest tightened. Took her? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Your mother didn't disappear, Eleanor. She was taken. And now, I believe your father, Daniel, is in danger for trying to stop them. Hannah shook her head. No, that doesn't make sense. If she was taken, why would he keep that from me? Why would he lie? Margaret's gaze was filled with sorrow. Because he was trying to protect you. Hannah's hands clenched. From who? Margaret hesitated. Then finally she spoke. The people who made sure you were never supposed to exist. Hannah's world shattered. She had spent years thinking she had lost her mother in a tragic accident. Thinking her father was just a broken man, drowning in his own guilt. But now the pieces of the puzzle were shifting, revealing something far more sinister. She wasn't just a girl with a missing father and a dead mother. She was part of something much bigger, and someone out there still wanted to keep her in the dark. Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. I can help you find the truth, but you have to trust me. Hannah's heart pounded. For years, she had wanted answers. Now, she had to decide if she was ready for them. Hannah's entire body felt numb. The woman standing in front of her, Margaret Hayes, claimed to be her grandmother. She claimed that her mother had been taken, not lost in some tragic accident. She claimed that Daniel Wright, the man who had raised her, had been hiding her from something, from someone. None of it made sense. And yet, deep inside, something in her stirred. Because the moment Margaret had spoken her real name, Eleanor Hayes Jr., it didn't sound foreign. It didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like something that had been buried so deep within her that she had forgotten it existed. John Carter was watching Margaret carefully, his arms crossed, his stance rigid. He had let her speak, but Hannah could tell he didn't trust her. And why should he? This woman had appeared out of nowhere, making claims that shattered everything Hannah thought she knew about her life. Hannah clenched her fists, her voice raw when she finally spoke. You're lying. Margaret didn't flinch. She just studied her, like she was memorizing every detail of her face. No, sweetheart, I'm not. Hannah shook her head, backing away. This is insane. No, I have a birth certificate. I have photos of my mother. My father would have told me if... Would he? Margaret's voice was gentle, but her words sliced through Hannah like a blade. Would he really? John cut in, his voice sharp. Enough. If you have proof of what you're saying, show it. Otherwise, you need to leave. Margaret sighed, reaching into her coat. Slowly, carefully, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and handed it to Hannah. Hannah hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, revealing an old hospital record. The paper was faded, the ink slightly smudged, but the name at the top was clear. Eleanor Hayes Jr., born in Raven Hollow General Hospital. Mother, Eleanor Hayes Sr. Father, unknown. Hannah's breath caught. She read it again and again. The information didn't change. Her name wasn't Hannah Wright. It never had been. John stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. "This could be fake," he said. Margaret arched a brow. "It could be, but it's not." Hannah's knees felt weak. She sat down on the couch, the hospital record still clutched in her hands. This doesn't prove anything," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow. Margaret sat down across from her, her voice softer now. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I know you have every reason to doubt me. But I swear to you, Eleanor." "Don't call me that," Hannah snapped, her voice breaking. "That's not my name." Margaret flinched, but she didn't argue. She just nodded. "All right, Hannah, then." Silence stretched between them. John finally spoke, his tone laced with frustration. "Let's say, for a second, that everything you're saying is true. Let's say Hannah, Eleanor, was taken from her real family. Why? And by who?" Margaret's expression darkened. "That," she said, "is the real question, isn't it?" Hannah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Margaret leaned forward, her voice lowering. "Your mother, my daughter, was a brilliant woman, but she got involved in something dangerous. Something she shouldn't have." Hannah swallowed hard. "Like what?" Margaret hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "A project. An experiment." And when she realized what was really happening, she tried to run. John's face hardened. "What kind of experiment?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "A medical one. A highly classified one. And she wasn't the only one who disappeared because of it." Hannah felt her stomach churn. "You're telling me my mother was... what? Some kind of scientist?" Margaret nodded. "She was a researcher at Raven Hollow Medical Institute. She specialized in genetic modifications. And she uncovered something she wasn't supposed to." Hannah's heart pounded. "What does that have to do with me?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know. Not exactly. But what I do know is that when she found out the truth, she ran. She took you with her. And then she vanished." John exhaled sharply. "And you think Daniel Wright was part of this?" Margaret's gaze turned cold. "I don't think Officer Carter." "I know." Hannah's hands clenched around the hospital record. "Daniel, her father, the man who had raised her, the man who had disappeared without a trace, the man who had lied to her for her entire life." She wanted to scream, to cry, to run. Instead, she whispered, "Then why did he take me?" Margaret's expression softened. "That's the one thing I don't know." Hannah let out a sharp laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Great. So you know everything except the one thing that actually matters." Margaret didn't react. She just studied her, sadness flickering in her eyes. "I know you don't trust me, and I don't expect you to. But I came here to warn you." John narrowed his eyes. "Warn her about what?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "If Daniel really is missing, that means they found him. And if they found him, they'll come for her next." The room went still. Hannah felt her entire body go rigid. John took a step forward. "Who?" Margaret met his gaze. "The people who wanted her mother dead." Hannah felt her lungs tighten. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. John's voice was steady but firm. "And what do you suggest we do?" Margaret's gaze returned to Hannah. "We find out what really happened to Daniel before they do." Hannah exhaled shakily. She had spent her whole life running from the past. Now it was time to face it. Hannah couldn't sleep. The weight of everything Margaret had told her settled deep in her bones, making her restless, uneasy. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words repeating over and over in her mind. "Your mother was taken. Your father was hiding you. And now they're coming for you too. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be true. And yet, the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Somewhere in the darkness of her childhood, in the blank spaces where memories should have been, the truth had been buried. Now, piece by piece, it was forcing its way to the surface, and Hannah wasn't sure if she was ready for it. She sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The house was silent. Too silent. John had stayed for a while after Margaret left, making sure she was okay, making sure she wasn't going to do anything reckless. But what was considered reckless when your whole life had just unraveled? Hannah ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing. She needed answers. And if she wasn't going to get them from Daniel, she had to find them herself. She grabbed her hoodie from the chair by the window, slipping it over her head. The night air was cold when she stepped outside, the wind biting at her skin. Raven Hollow was quiet, the streets empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. She walked quickly, keeping her head down. There was only one place she could go: the police station. John had access to files that she didn't. If there was anything in the system about Daniel, anything at all, she needed to see it. She reached the station in less than 10 minutes. The building was dark, except for the dim glow of the desk lamp at the front. The night officer on duty barely glanced up when she walked in. "Officer Carter in?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. The man nodded, jerking his thumb toward the back. "Third office on the left." She didn't waste time. She pushed through the doors, moving down the hall until she reached John's office. The door was cracked open, and she knocked lightly before stepping inside. John looked up from his desk, eyebrows raising. "Hannah? What the hell are you doing here?" She shut the door behind her, leaning against it. "I need to see my father's file." John sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Hannah, don't," she cut him off. "Don't tell me it's classified. Don't tell me it's an open case. I don't care. I need to see it." John exhaled slowly, studying her. "This isn't a good idea." She crossed her arms. "Neither was lying to me my whole life. But here we are." That seemed to hit a nerve. John muttered something under his breath before pushing back from his desk. He stood, moving to the filing cabinet in the corner. "You didn't get this from me," he said, pulling out a thick manila folder. Hannah's stomach twisted as he handed it to her. She moved to the chair across from his desk, sitting down before opening it. The first page was a report. Missing person, Daniel Wright. Date reported 3 weeks ago. Last known location, Raven Hollow, New York. Current status, unknown. Hannah's throat tightened. 3 weeks. That was how long he had been gone. Long enough for people to stop asking questions. Long enough for the town to assume he had just walked away from everything. But Hannah knew better. She flipped the page. The next section was a background check. A list of places Daniel had lived, jobs he had worked. And then, a note at the bottom. Alias, Daniel Hayes. Hannah's fingers tightened around the paper. "Jesus," she whispered. John leaned forward. "Keep going." She swallowed hard, turning the page. The next section was redacted. Large black bars covered lines of text, concealing information she wasn't supposed to see. Her pulse pounded. "What the hell is this?" John hesitated. "That's the part one can't access." She looked up at him. "You're telling me someone locked my father's file? Why?" John shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever did it doesn't want anyone finding out what he was involved in." Hannah clenched her jaw. She flipped through the rest of the folder, searching for something. Anything that could give her answers. And then, on the last page, she found it. A photograph. It was grainy, black and white, taken from a security camera. A man standing in an alley, half hidden by shadows. The timestamp in the corner was from 2 weeks ago. Hannah's breath caught. It was Daniel. He was alive. She shot to her feet, holding up the picture. Where was this taken? John took it from her, studying it. A motel just outside of town. But by the time we got there, he was already gone. Hannah's mind raced. If he was still out there, she could find him. She had to find him. John must have seen the look in her eyes, because he sighed. Hannah, don't do anything stupid. She ignored him, already moving toward the door. Thanks for the file, Carter. Hannah, but she was already gone. She didn't stop walking until she was outside again, the cold air shocking her lungs. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing the only number she could think of. Margaret answered on the first ring. You were right, Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's alive. A pause. Then, where? Hannah exhaled. A motel outside of town. But he's already gone. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then, meet me at my house. We need to talk. Hannah hesitated. She still wasn't sure if she could trust her. But what other choice did she have? Fine, she said. I'll be there soon. She hung up, stuffing her phone into her pocket. If Daniel was alive, she was going to find him. And when she did, she was going to get the truth, whether he wanted to give it to her or not. The night was colder than usual, the wind slicing through Hannah's hoodie as she walked toward Margaret Hayes' house. The street was empty, the kind of eerie silence that made her hyper-aware of every sound. The rustling of leaves, the distant hum of a street lamp, the faint echo of her own footsteps. She hadn't been to Margaret's house before. She hadn't even known Margaret existed until a few hours ago. Now, she was walking straight into the lion's den. Desperate for answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Her mind was racing. Daniel was alive. That meant everything Margaret had said wasn't just a theory. It was real. The missing persons report, the birth certificate with the name Eleanor Hayes Jr., the classified files in John's office. All of it pointed to a horrifying truth. Her entire life had been built on a lie. And now she was about to find out why. Margaret's house was a small, two-story building near the edge of town. The lights were on, casting a warm glow against the dark sky. Hannah hesitated on the porch, her fingers tightening into fists. She could still turn around. She could walk away, pretend none of this was happening. But the image of Daniel in that grainy security photo flashed in her mind. He was out there somewhere, hiding, running, and she needed to know why. She took a deep breath and knocked. Margaret opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting. She was dressed differently now, no longer in the pristine coat she had worn earlier. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair slightly undone, as if she had spent the past hour pacing the house. You came, she said. Hannah swallowed hard. You said you had answers. Margaret stepped aside, letting her in. The inside of the house was warm, filled with the scent of something familiar, old paper, a hint of lavender. The living room was neat, almost too neat, like it belonged to someone who didn't use it often. Margaret motioned toward the couch. Sit. Hannah hesitated, then did as she was told. Margaret sat across from her, folding her hands in her lap. For a long moment, she just studied Hannah, her expression unreadable. Then finally she spoke. Before I tell you anything, I need you to understand that your mother, Eleanor, was a good person. She didn't deserve what happened to her. Hannah felt something tighten in her chest. What did happen to her? Margaret sighed. That's the question I've been asking myself for 20 years. Hannah clenched her fists. You said she was taken. She was. Margaret's gaze darkened. And I believe your father was involved. Hannah's stomach churned. Daniel wouldn't. You don't know that, Margaret cut in, her voice sharp. You think you do, but you don't. Hannah shook her head. He raised me. Margaret's expression softened. I know, and I believe in his own way he cared about you. But that doesn't change what he did. Hannah's pulse pounded. What are you saying? Margaret exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. Daniel wasn't just a cop. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. And when your mother tried to escape, he was the one sent to bring her back. Hannah's vision blurred. No, that couldn't be right. Margaret kept going. She must have convinced him not to do it. Maybe she made him see the truth. Maybe he loved her. I don't know. But instead of turning her in, he ran with her. He hid her. And he hid you. Hannah's head was spinning. You're saying my whole life was a cover, Margaret finished, to protect you from the people who wanted you gone. Hannah stood abruptly, shaking her head. This is insane. Margaret watched her carefully. Is it? Hannah's chest ached. Why would anyone want me gone? I'm nobody. Margaret hesitated. Then, finally, she said, because you were part of the experiment too. Hannah felt like the air had been sucked from the room. She stared at Margaret, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. What? Margaret reached for something on the coffee table. A file. Old, worn, the pages inside yellowed with time. She opened it, flipping through the documents before pulling one out. She handed it to Hannah. Hannah's hands shook as she took it. Her name was at the top. Eleanor Hayes Jr. Age 2. Status. Subject 34. Hannah's blood ran cold. This is a lie, she whispered. Margaret's expression didn't change. It's not. Hannah clenched her fists. What was the experiment? Margaret hesitated. Then, softly, they were trying to change people before they were even born. Hannah's stomach turned. Your mother worked for a research facility that specialized in genetic modification. She thought she was helping people, but she wasn't. She was creating something. And when she realized what they were really doing, she tried to stop it. Hannah felt like she couldn't breathe. What were they doing? Margaret looked at her, her expression unreadable. They were trying to make people better, stronger, smarter, but it wasn't natural, and it wasn't safe. Hannah's hands clenched around the paper. And me? Margaret exhaled. You were one of them, one of their experiments. Hannah's vision blurred. No. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Yes. Hannah felt sick. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. She dropped the file onto the coffee table, backing away. No, you're wrong. I'm just normal. Margaret studied her. Are you? Hannah clenched her jaw. I don't. She stopped, shaking her head. This is insane. You're insane. Margaret didn't flinch. Maybe. Hannah turned, heading for the door. Margaret's voice stopped her. Where are you going? Hannah swallowed hard. To find my father. Margaret sighed. That's exactly what they want you to do. Hannah hesitated. Margaret stood. Whoever locked his file, whoever erased the records, whoever sent you that letter, they wanted you to start asking questions. They wanted you to go looking for him. Hannah clenched her fists. Why? Margaret's gaze darkened. Because you're the only loose end left. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Margaret took a step closer. Whoever is behind this, they didn't finish the job 20 years ago. And now they're trying to correct that mistake. Hannah's pulse pounded. So what do I do? She whispered. Margaret's voice was quiet. You survive. Hannah closed her eyes. She had spent her whole life feeling like something was missing, like a piece of her had been lost. Now she knew why, and she wasn't going to stop until she found out the truth, no matter what it cost. Hannah left Margaret's house with her mind in turmoil. The air outside was sharp and cold, stinging her skin as she walked down the empty street. Everything felt unreal. The night, the silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest like a vice. She was an experiment. Her entire existence, everything she had ever known about herself, had been a carefully crafted lie. She wanted to scream, to tear through the quiet town, demanding answers from people who didn't even know what was happening. But she couldn't. No one knew. No one could know. The only person who had answers was gone. Daniel. She had to find him. Margaret had warned her that going after him was exactly what they wanted. But who were they? Who was controlling this nightmare from the shadows, waiting for her to take the wrong step? She needed to clear her head. Instead of going home, she walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind replaying everything she had learned. Daniel wasn't her real father. Her mother had been part of some genetic experiment. And now the people responsible were tying up loose ends. She wasn't safe, and she never had been. Her feet carried her toward the one place she had always felt safe growing up, the old library on Main Street. It had been abandoned for years, the roof sagging, the windows cracked. But the doors were still unlocked. She knew because she used to sneak inside when she needed to be alone. Tonight, she needed that solitude more than ever. She slipped through the doors, the air inside stale and thick with dust. The moonlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating the shelves filled with forgotten books. She let out a shaky breath, pressing her back against the door, trying to ground herself. For a long moment, she just stood there, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Then, a noise, a soft creak. Her body tensed instantly. She wasn't alone. Her fingers curled into fists as she stepped forward, moving deeper into the library. The silence was thick, pressing against her ears like a warning. She strained to listen, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Another creak, then footsteps. Hannah's heart pounded. She ducked behind a row of bookshelves, pressing herself into the shadows. Someone was here. Someone was following her. She held her breath, her mind racing. Was it them? Was it the same people who had taken her mother? The footsteps grew louder, closer. She clenched her jaw, preparing to move. And then, a voice. Low, familiar. Hannah. Her breath hitched. She knew that voice. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped out from the shadows. Daniel. He stood near the center of the library, his face gaunt, his clothes disheveled. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't quite name. Relief, fear. Hannah's chest tightened. Dad? For a long moment he didn't move. Then finally he exhaled. I was hoping you wouldn't find me. She clenched her fists. Too bad. Daniel swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the windows as if expecting someone to burst in at any second. You shouldn't be here. Hannah's nails dug into her palms. Neither should you. A bitter laugh escaped him. Guess we both made mistakes. She took a step closer. Where have you been? Daniel hesitated. Then finally he said, running. The word hit her like a punch. From what? She demanded. Daniel's jaw tightened. From them. Hannah's heart pounded. Who are they? His eyes darkened. The people who made you. The words sent a chill down her spine. You knew, she whispered. Daniel exhaled sharply. Yes. Hannah felt like the ground was crumbling beneath her. How long? Daniel's expression was unreadable. Since the beginning, a wave of nausea rolled through her. You lied to me. His face twisted with something like regret. I protected you. By lying to me? He took a step closer. By keeping you alive. Her chest ached. Who are they, Dad? What did they do to me? Daniel hesitated. Then finally he said, they didn't just experiment on you, Hannah. They built you. The words made her stomach drop. Built. Like she was a machine. Project. Something created in a lab. Daniel ran a hand down his face. You were never supposed to survive. But your mother. She couldn't let them finish what they started. So she ran. And I ran with her. Hannah's throat tightened. Then why didn't you tell me? Daniel's gaze was pained. Because I didn't want you to know what you were. Hannah's whole body went cold. What I was, she echoed. Daniel swallowed hard. What you are. She took a step back, shaking her head. No, that's not. You feel it, don't you? Daniel interrupted. The things that don't make sense. The memories that don't belong to you. The instincts you can't explain. Hannah's pulse pounded. She did. She always had. The flashes of things she couldn't remember experiencing. The way she knew things she shouldn't. The way her body moved faster, reacted quicker, healed quicker. She had ignored it, pushed it down, told herself she was imagining things. But she wasn't, and she never had been. Tears burned her eyes. What am I? Daniel looked at her, his face etched with something broken. My biggest mistake, he whispered. The words shattered her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, glass shattered. The sound echoed through the library, sharp and violent. Daniel's eyes widened. They found us. Panic surged through Hannah's veins. Daniel grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the back exit. We have to go. Now. Hannah's mind raced, but she didn't have time to process what was happening. Footsteps thundered behind them. Daniel shoved open the back door, pulling her into the alley. Car was waiting, the engine running. Daniel threw open the door, pushing her inside. Get in. Hannah barely had time to react before he slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped into the night. Hannah's breath came in short gasps. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. "We don't have much time." Hannah forced herself to breathe. "Where are we going?" Daniel didn't look at her. "Somewhere safe." Hannah's chest ached. "Is there even a safe place left?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "We're about to find out." The car sped into the darkness, leaving Raven Hollow behind. Hannah didn't look back, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she had a home to return to. The road stretched ahead of them, endless and dark, the headlights slicing through the emptiness like a blade. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires against the pavement, the rhythmic beating of Hannah's heart still uneven in her chest. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, fingers curled into fists on her lap, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The library, the shattered glass, the way Daniel had grabbed her and told her to run without hesitation. He had known they would come. She turned her head slightly, studying his profile in the dim glow of the dashboard. His face was tight, his grip on the steering wheel like a vice, the muscles in his jaw clenching every few seconds. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that made her stomach twist. "How long?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't look at her. "How long what? How long have they been following you?" His fingers flexed against the wheel. "Since the day I left." Hannah swallowed hard. "And you never thought to tell me?" Daniel let out a sharp breath, his eyes still fixed on the road. "I thought I had more time." Hannah let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Time? Time for what?" "For them to find me first." His knuckles whitened. "To figure out how to stop them." A heavy silence fell between them. Hannah turned her gaze to the window, watching the trees blur past in the night. She could feel it now, how everything had shifted, how nothing would ever go back to the way it was. For years, she had lived in ignorance, believing she was just a girl with a broken family, an ordinary person with a past marked by loss and grief. But now she knew the truth. She wasn't ordinary. She never had been. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. "Where are we going?" Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. "Somewhere they won't find us." Hannah scoffed. "And where exactly is that?" He hesitated. "There's someone I need to see." Hannah frowned. "Who?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "I need you to trust me, Hannah." She stiffened. "That's a little hard to do when you've been lying to me my whole life." Daniel's face was unreadable. "I never lied about loving you." Hannah inhaled sharply, her throat tightening. The worst part was that she believed him, but it didn't change the fact that everything else had been a lie. She turned her attention back to the road, trying to quiet the storm raging inside her. She wanted to scream, to demand every answer he had been keeping from her. But something told her she wouldn't get them. Not yet. They drove for hours, the tension thick and suffocating. Hannah watched as the familiar roads of Raven Hollow faded behind them, replaced by stretches of highway and unfamiliar landscapes. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, her eyelids growing heavy despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She must have drifted off at some point, because when she opened her eyes, the car had stopped. Her head snapped up, her heart pounding. "Where are we?" Daniel was already out of the car, standing near the trunk. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of rain lingering in the atmosphere. They were in front of an old cabin, tucked deep into the woods, hidden from the road by thick trees. Hannah's stomach twisted. "Who lives here?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the porch, knocking twice on the wooden door. Seconds passed. Then the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was older, with gray threading through his dark hair, his sharp eyes scanning Daniel before flicking to Hannah. "Was wondering when you'd show up," the man muttered. Daniel exhaled. "It's been a long time, Carter." Hannah's blood ran cold. "Carter?" The man's gaze settled on her. "John's father." Hannah's stomach lurched. "Wait, what?" Daniel motioned for her to follow him inside. "Come on. We don't have much time." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but she forced her feet to move. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, cluttered but lived in. Papers and old books were scattered across the wooden table, along with a map covered in markings. Hannah's eyes darted over the clutter, trying to make sense of it all. John's father, Carter Sr., closed the door behind them, locking it before turning back to Daniel. "Do they know you're here?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet, but they will," Carter sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Damn it, right? You should have come sooner." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't have a choice." Carter's gaze flickered to Hannah. "She doesn't know everything yet, does she?" Hannah stiffened. "I'm right here, you know." Carter let out a dry chuckle. "You sound like her." Hannah frowned. "Like who?" Carter's expression softened for the first time. "Your mother." A lump formed in Hannah's throat. Carter turned to Daniel. "Did you tell her about the files?" Daniel hesitated. "Not yet." Hannah's heart pounded. "What files?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple. "The ones that prove why they want you." Hannah's pulse spiked. "And where exactly are these files?" Carter motioned to the table. "Right there." Hannah's breath hitched. She moved closer, reaching for the stack of papers. Her hands trembled as she flipped through them, scanning the pages. Her name, Eleanor Hayes Jr., was everywhere. But there was something else. A symbol. A code she didn't recognize. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter crossed his arms. "That's the project that started it all." Hannah's stomach twisted. "Project H." Carter nodded. "You were never just a girl, Hannah. You were the final test." The words made her head spin. Daniel took a step closer. "Your mother tried to stop them." She ran. But she knew they wouldn't stop hunting her. So she did the only thing she could. Hannah's hands curled into fists. "She hid me." Daniel nodded. "And I helped." Hannah's chest ached. For years she had felt lost, like something was missing. Now she knew why. She had spent her whole life running from a past she didn't remember. And now it was time to face it. Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple. "We don't have much time. If they know you're here, they'll come." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we end this before they do." Hannah swallowed hard. She wasn't ready, but she didn't have a choice. The past was catching up to her, and this time she wasn't running. The weight of the files in Hannah's hands felt heavier than paper should. Each page carried fragments of a life she hadn't known she lived, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was part of. The name Project H glared at her from multiple documents. The ink faded, but still holding enough power to shake her to her core. She read line after line, scanning through medical jargon she barely understood, descriptions that made her stomach twist in knots. There were test results, hers, dating back to before she could even remember. Blood work, genetic sequencing, modifications. She wasn't just part of an experiment. She was the experiment. Her breath hitched as her eyes landed on a particular paragraph, the words sharp and clinical. Subject 34 demonstrates enhanced cognitive reflexes, heightened durability, and resistance to cellular degradation. Unlike previous subjects, neural reprogramming shows inconsistencies. Retains memories inconsistent with controlled variables. High risk. Potential termination recommended. She clenched her fists. Termination recommended. A sharp inhale broke through the silence. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. Across the room, Daniel stood stiffly, his gaze locked onto her, reading the horror on her face. "You weren't supposed to see that," he muttered. Hannah's pulse pounded in her ears. "Then when exactly was I supposed to see it? After they came for me? After they terminated me?" Daniel ran a hand over his face, looking like he was carrying a weight even heavier than the one crushing her chest. "I didn't know about that part," he admitted. Hannah let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Of course you didn't." She turned to Carter, her grip on the pages tightening. "How much of this is real?" The older man's face was unreadable. "All of it." Hannah's stomach twisted. She forced herself to take a deep breath. You said my mother tried to stop them. What was she stopping? Carter hesitated before grabbing another file from the table. He opened it, flipping through the pages before handing it to her. This is what she found before she disappeared. Hannah's eyes darted across the text, her breath catching as she read. Subjects 1 to 33, deceased. Her skin went cold. She flipped through page after page, each one confirming the same grim fate for those who came before her. Except her. She was the only one who had survived. She looked up, her throat dry. What happened to them? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. They weren't stable. Their bodies rejected the modifications. Some didn't last past infancy. Others made it longer, but not by much. Hannah felt like she was going to be sick. And me? Carter exhaled. You were the first one that worked. Hannah's chest ached. She wasn't sure if she wanted to scream or cry. Daniel took a cautious step closer. Your mother didn't know what she was part of until it was too late. When she realized what was happening to the other children, she took you and ran. Hannah clenched her jaw. And you helped? Daniel nodded. I was supposed to bring her back. I didn't. Carter crossed his arms. And that's why they came after her. Hannah swallowed hard. Who are they? Daniel exhaled sharply. The people behind this. The people who funded it. The ones who wanted to build something they couldn't control. Hannah's hands shook. Why didn't they just kill me back then? Carter's face darkened. They tried. The words sent a chill down her spine. Daniel's jaw tightened. Your mother knew they wouldn't stop, so she made sure they couldn't find you. She changed your name, changed your records, did everything she could to make sure you blended in. But even she knew it wouldn't last forever. Hannah's chest felt tight. And now they've found me. Carter nodded grimly. Yes. A heavy silence fell over the room. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to steady herself. When she opened them, she looked at Daniel. What now? Daniel didn't hesitate. We run. Carter scoffed. Running won't solve anything. Daniel's gaze hardened. It will keep her alive. Hannah's stomach twisted. I'm done running. Daniel's expression faltered. Hannah. No, she snapped. They've already taken everything from me. My mother, my identity, my past. I won't let them take my future too. Carter nodded approvingly. She's right. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Then we need a plan. Hannah exhaled sharply. Then let's make one. Daniel hesitated before looking at Carter. We need leverage. Carter nodded. We need to find out who's behind this. And we need to hit them where it hurts. Hannah glanced between them. How? Carter motioned toward the files. There's one name we haven't looked at yet. Hannah frowned, flipping through the documents again. And then she saw it. A name buried in the footnotes of one of the reports. Dr. Thomas Calloway. Hannah's pulse spiked. Who is he? Carter's expression darkened. The man who started it all. Hannah's breath caught. He's still alive? Carter nodded. And if anyone has the answers, it's him. Daniel clenched his fists. Then we find him. Hannah exhaled slowly. For years, she had been in the dark. Now she was finally stepping into the light. And no matter what it took, she was going to finish this. The weight of Dr. Thomas Calloway's name lingered in the air long after it was spoken. Hannah felt it settle deep in her bones. A cold, heavy truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The man who had started it all. The man who had played God with her life before she even had a chance to live it. If anyone had the answers, it was him. And now, after years of running, after all the lies and betrayals, they were finally going to find him. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself, but her hands were still trembling. Across the room, Daniel was pacing, his expression unreadable. Carter sat at the table, flipping through pages of old reports, his brows furrowed in deep concentration. The small cabin around them felt suffocating, the walls pressing in, as if the very air knew they were on borrowed time. We don't even know where to start, Daniel muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. Carter tapped his fingers against the stack of files. We start with what we do know. Hannah forced herself to focus, pushing past the storm of emotions swirling inside her. You said Calloway was the one who started it all. That means he has to be connected to whoever is still running things. Carter nodded. That's what we need to find out. Daniel exhaled sharply. If he's still alive, he's gone underground. No one just disappears without help. Someone's protecting him. Hannah clenched her jaw. Then we make him come to us. Daniel stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. How exactly do you plan on doing that? Hannah's pulse pounded. By making him think he's already been found. Carter arched a brow. You have a plan? Hannah hesitated, then nodded. We let them know we have the files. Daniel frowned. That's suicide. No, Hannah said firmly. It's leverage. Carter leaned forward. Go on. Hannah took a deep breath. Whoever's behind this, they've spent years making sure no one finds out what they did. They erased records, changed names, made people disappear. If they think we have proof, they'll do anything to get it back. Daniel's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean they'll give us Calloway. Hannah's stomach twisted. They will if they think we're about to expose everything. Carter studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. It's risky. Daniel shook his head. It's reckless. Hannah crossed her arms. It's our best shot. Silence. Then finally Daniel sighed. How do we do it? Hannah swallowed hard. We go public. Daniel's eyes darkened. That's not an option. Why not? Hannah shot back. Because it makes us a target? Newsflash, Dad, we already are. Daniel's expression twisted at the word dad. But he didn't argue. Carter exhaled. We need to be smart about this. We can't just throw everything out there and hope for the best. Hannah nodded. Then we leak just enough to make them nervous. Carter ran a hand through his graying hair. I might know a guy. Daniel's gaze snapped to him. Who? Carter hesitated. An old friend. He works with investigative journalists. The kind that don't scare easy. Daniel clenched his jaw. You trust him? Carter let out a dry chuckle. No, but I trust that he likes a good story. Hannah exhaled. Then let's give him one. Daniel sighed heavily. This is a bad idea. Hannah's chest ached, but she held her ground. Do you have a better one? Silence. Daniel ran a hand down his face. Fine, but if we do this, we do it my way. Hannah crossed her arms. What's your way? Daniel's expression hardened. We set a trap. Carter frowned. For who? Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. For whoever comes looking. Hannah's pulse spiked. And what happens when they do? Daniel's eyes darkened. We make them talk. Hannah swallowed hard. They were running out of time. And soon, the truth would finally come out. The plan came together faster than Hannah expected. Carter made the call, setting up a meeting with his contact in a secluded diner just outside of town. The man's name was Mark Holloway, a former journalist who had spent years digging into government conspiracies. If anyone could get their story out, it was him. Hannah sat in the back seat of the car as Daniel drove, her heart pounding with every mile they put between them and the cabin. She knew they were being watched. They had been since the moment they left Raven Hollow. Carter sat in the passenger seat, silent, his gaze scanning the road ahead. He was tense, the way someone got when they knew trouble was coming. Hannah clenched her fists. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, and she was ready. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived. A flickering neon sign buzzed above the entrance, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. Daniel pulled into a spot near the back, keeping the car running. Carter turned to Hannah. Stay here. Hannah stiffened. No. Daniel shot her a look. Hannah, I'm not waiting in the car while you make decisions about my life. Carter exhaled. Fine, but stay close. They stepped out of the car, moving toward the entrance. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in, the smell of coffee and grease thick in the air. Mark was already there, sitting in a booth near the back, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as they approached, his gaze sharp. Carter slid into the seat across from him. Mark smirked. Carter, it's been a long time. Carter nodded. Not long enough. Mark's gaze flickered to Hannah. So this is her. Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. You know who I am? Mark chuckled. I know what you are. Daniel tensed. Then you know why we're here. Mark leaned back, studying them. You want to out the people behind Project H. Hannah clenched her jaw. We want Calloway. Mark raised an eyebrow. That's a name I haven't heard in years. Daniel's voice was tight. Do you know where he is? Mark hesitated. I might. Hannah leaned forward. Then tell us. Mark exhaled. It's not that simple. Carter frowned. Why? Mark's expression darkened. Because he's already dead. Hannah's stomach dropped. Daniel's hands curled into fists. How? Mark hesitated. You don't want to know. Hannah's pulse pounded. Yes, I do. Mark studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he said he was killed 6 months ago. And whoever did it didn't want a body left behind. Hannah's breath caught. Daniel's face was unreadable. Then who's pulling the strings now? Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the real question, isn't it? Silence. Then the bell above the door jingled. Hannah's heart pounded. Mark's eyes flicked toward the entrance, his expression shifting. We have company. Daniel's voice was sharp. Go. Carter grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her toward the back exit. The air outside was cold, the night heavy with the kind of stillness that came before a storm. Hannah clenched her fists. She wasn't running anymore. It was time to finish this. The night was heavy, the kind of oppressive darkness that pressed against Hannah's skin like a warning. The cold air burned her lungs as she ran, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Carter's grip on her arm was tight, pulling her through the narrow alley behind the diner. Behind them, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the pavement. Whoever had walked into that diner wasn't there for a late-night meal. They were there for her. Daniel was ahead of them, moving fast despite the years of exhaustion weighing on his body. His gun was drawn, his shoulders tense as he scanned the dimly lit street. Mark had been right. This wasn't just about exposing Project H. There were people in the shadows who still wanted to keep their secrets buried. Cars around the corner, Daniel said, his voice low but urgent. Carter shoved open a rusted metal gate, leading them into an empty lot. The car was parked near the far end, half hidden by the overgrown weeds creeping through the cracks in the pavement. Hannah's pulse pounded. They were so close. A sharp sound split the air. A gunshot. Daniel spun, shoving Hannah down as the bullet ricocheted off the concrete wall behind them. Carter cursed under his breath, pulling his own weapon. Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs. They weren't going to make it out of this without a fight. From the darkness, a voice called out. Daniel Wright. The tone was calm. Too calm. Daniel's jaw tightened. Who's asking? Footsteps. Slow. Measured. A figure emerged from the shadows, his face half illuminated by the flickering streetlight above. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of composed demeanor that made Hannah's stomach twist. I was hoping we'd meet under different circumstances, the man said smoothly. Daniel didn't lower his weapon. Wish I could say the same. Hannah's hands curled into fists. There was something about the man's voice, the way he looked at her, like he already knew everything about her, like she was a problem he had already solved. You have something that belongs to me, the man said. Daniel's eyes darkened. She's not yours. The man smiled. That's where you're wrong. Hannah's breath hitched. Daniel shifted, placing himself between her and the stranger. You think we're just going to hand her over? The man tilted his head. No, but I do think you'll listen to what I have to say. Carter scoffed. We don't negotiate with ghosts. The man chuckled. Oh, I'm very real. He turned his gaze to Hannah. And so are you. Hannah's skin prickled. I don't know who the hell you are, she snapped, but I'm not yours. I never was. The man exhaled softly. That's what your mother thought too. The words hit her like a knife. Hannah clenched her fists. What do you know about my mother? The man took a slow step forward. I know she was a brilliant scientist. I know she tried to change things she didn't understand. And I know she made a terrible mistake when she ran. Hannah's stomach twisted. She didn't make a mistake. She saved me. The man nodded, almost as if he had expected her to say that. She tried. But you can't run from what you are. Hannah's breath came in sharp gasps. Daniel's grip on the gun tightened. You're wasting your time. The man sighed. Am I? His gaze flickered back to Hannah. You felt it, haven't you? The way your body heals too quickly. The way your mind processes things faster than it should. The memories that don't belong to you. Hannah's pulse spiked. He took another step forward. You were the first successful subject, he said. The only one who survived. And we need you back. Hannah felt her world tilt. No, she whispered. The man's expression softened. You don't understand yet, but you will. Daniel took a step forward. His gun trained on the man's chest. You're not taking her. The man's gaze flicked to Daniel, and for the first time, something dark passed over his face. You think you saved her? He asked, his voice like silk wrapped around steel. You think hiding her gave her a normal life? He shook his head. You just delayed the inevitable. Hannah's breath hitched. You're lying, she spat. The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Am I? The air was too thick, too heavy. Hannah could feel the weight of something shifting, something irreversible. And then, Daniel pulled the trigger. The man moved fast, too fast. The bullet missed by inches, embedding itself into the brick wall behind him. The man didn't even flinch. Wrong move, he murmured. Before Hannah could react, before she could scream, something sharp jabbed into her neck. A needle. Her vision blurred instantly, the world tilting sideways. Daniel yelled her name. Carter's gun went off. Everything went dark. She woke up in a room that wasn't hers. The lights above were blinding, cold and sterile. The walls were white, too white, like a hospital that had been stripped of any warmth. Hannah's body felt heavy, her limbs sluggish as she tried to move. A dull ache throbbed at the base of her skull. She wasn't alone. A figure sat in the corner of the room, watching her. The man from the alley. Panic surged through her veins. She forced her body to sit up, her breath shaky. Where am I? The man leaned forward. Somewhere safe. She let out a sharp laugh. Safe. He nodded. We didn't hurt you. We just needed to talk. Hannah clenched her fists. You drugged me. The man sighed. You were being difficult. Rage burned in her chest. What do you want from me? His gaze softened. I want you to understand. Hannah's breath hitched. You were created for something bigger than yourself, he said. You have a purpose, a future. She shook her head. No, I have a life, and I'm going back to it. The man tilted his head. Are you? Hannah's stomach twisted. You're different, he said. You always have been. And soon you'll see why. Hannah swallowed hard. And if I refuse? His smile didn't reach his eyes. You won't. The door behind him opened. And then, Daniel. His face was bruised, his hands bound, his breathing uneven. But his eyes locked onto hers instantly. Hannah's chest ached. The man stood. You want your father back? Hannah's pulse spiked. Don't touch him. The man ignored her. Then listen carefully. Silence. And then, we're giving you a choice. Hannah's fingers curled into fists. You come with us, he said. Or he dies. The words echoed in her skull. She looked at Daniel. At the man who had lied to her. At the man who had raised her. At the man who had saved her. And she knew. There was no choice. She exhaled shakily. Then, quietly, okay. The man smiled. And everything went black.